All right, we're live. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me in the latest of my virtual town hall series. My name is Joe Gravellese, candidate for state representative in the Democratic primary in the 16th Suffolk District, which is Revere, Saugus, and Chelsea. And unbelievably, the primary election is coming up on September 1st in just 15 days. And I was chatting with Senator Downing before we came on air, and I was talking about how the first time I did this, it was March. And it was like I guess we'll just do these virtual town halls for a couple weeks until we get past this, coronavirus scare. Yeah. And then as it turns out, this is still the way that we have to engage and answer questions and talk to people face to face. So not great, but I love and appreciate the fact that I have a great special guest today, former state senator Ben Downing. I'll let Ben introduce himself a little bit, talk about his time in the legislature and what he's up to now, and then I'll tell you a little bit about why I invited him to join me today. So, Ben, take it away.
Yeah, sure, Joe, and thanks for letting me join you in the way that we join people these days. So like Joe said, my name is Ben Downing. For 10 years, from 2006 to 2016, I served in the state Senate in Massachusetts. Representing the 52 communities of the Berkshire, Hampshire, Franklin, and Hamden district, communities as big as my hometown, Pittsfield, about a city of about 45,000 people, gateway city like Revere and Chelsea are, all the way down to small communities of Monroe and Rowe, population 120, 150 people. And during that time, I was the chair of the Telecom Utilities and Energy Committee, focused a lot of my time at the State House on climate and clean energy issues, also focused on gateway city economic development, tackling poverty, and trying to expand civil rights in Massachusetts. In the 3.5, now almost 4 years since I left the legislature, I've worked at Nexamp, a veteran-founded clean energy developer, owner, operator, with a specialty in community solar, founded here in Massachusetts, based here in Massachusetts, and growing nationwide. And when I have some free time, when I'm not chasing a 3.5-year-old son and a now almost 4-month-old son here in East Boston, every once in a while I'll weigh in on debates at the State House where Joe and I both once worked. And these days I call home just down the blue line from Joe, living in East Boston, where interestingly enough, my dad's parents were both from before they moved out to Pittsfield. And actually, Joe, I think my mom's mother, my Nana, Cheryl Brackett, was actually born in Revere, was born in the district.
Really? At the old Revere Hospital?
Yeah, absolutely. And her and my papa. So she would have been Cheryl Trussell at that point, and then my papa Frank Brackett, who grew up in Brookline. They were actually married in Revere too. So it's a small world.
Yeah, no kidding. I had no idea that you had such a Revere connection. But the reason why I wanted to talk to you was two reasons. First of all, I worked at the State House around the time that you were there serving. Our time overlapped. I worked for Representative Lori Ehrlich from 2013 to 2016, and we worked on a lot of the same bills and a lot of the same issues. Through Rep Ehrlich's work, we did a lot of environmental work together, your office and my office. But then also, I was always especially interested in your work with gateway cities as a Revere kid, and someone who was always interested in, how can we bring sustainable, equitable, fair development to our gateway cities? So if you're not steeped in Massachusetts political culture, that's the term that we use for a lot of our sort of, I guess, secondary cities in Massachusetts that, maybe once had a thriving industrial sector or manufacturing sector. And a lot of them did go through some tough times, and Revere went through some tough times, and Chelsea went through some tough times, and Worcester and Springfield and Holyoke and Pittsfield. And, there's been a concerted effort to think, how do we revive these communities, but not, in a way that displaces the people that are already there, but really lifts up the people that are already there. And that really, in some ways, is like a fundamental challenge of our time. And no one's quite figured out the answers yet. If we did, we'd probably be, we wouldn't be, sitting in these seats. We'd be somewhere more powerful. But the reason why I wanted Senator Downing to join me today is he recently wrote an article that really struck a chord with me in Commonwealth magazine. where he basically, the gist of it was Beacon Hill needs to pick up the pace. And in it, he listed essentially all the reasons why I decided to run for state representative, which is that, I'm 32, and my generation is looking at, an ongoing transportation calamity that we've kind of hit the pause button on because of COVID. But eventually, the economy will recover at some point. We'll be staring down that traffic catastrophe that we had before again. And we've known this was coming for 10, 12, 15 years and didn't do enough about it. We have a series of environmental crises, both short-term, in terms of the public health effects of pollution, which we've seen play out through COVID, and also in the sort of, it's not really long-term, now it's short to medium-term threats of climate change, where we're already seeing increased coastal flooding and extreme storms and flood insurance rates going through the roof, and just not nearly enough urgent action on that. And then also just these continuing issues, especially in communities like Revere and Chelsea and Saugus as well, of sort of lack of access to the same level of opportunity, whether it be to go to pre-K or to go to college or to have access to good jobs as someone that's born in a Wellesley or a Belmont or a Newton. And none of these problems are things that we didn't see and anticipate and know were coming down the pipe 10, 15 years ago. But we just really haven't taken that leadership role that Massachusetts historically has done throughout history, sort of leading the way on addressing these kinds of issues. And so, Senator, I don't know, I'm still inclined to call you Senator. I know, I guess I'll call you Ben. When you work in the legislature, that's one of those habits that die, refer to everyone by their title. But I think Senator Ben and I are similar in that I think people who work in the State House kind of end up having one of two reactions to it. Either, well, this is the way things are, and this is how it is, and this is just the way it always will be, so I'm going to go along with it. Or like, what is going on here, and how can we try to change this? And you and I are in that, like, how can we try to change this for the better category? So if you wouldn't mind, for my viewers, just sum up sort of the main points of your article, and then what are the structural barriers that are really preventing us from tackling these things?
Yeah, sure. And to add to your sort of general point, Joe, I think you and I come to this from the sort of the same position in that we've seen when the State House works, right? We know how many good people are there, well-intentioned, who want to move the dial on these issues. And we also know in our own respective home communities how much talent and energy and resources are there that are willing to be tapped to be a part of these efforts. And, the thing for me, especially as we have stumbled into this pandemic nationally, right, is that unfortunately the lack of leadership at the federal level has put that much more onus on state and local governments to step up. And we have seen time and time again that when it comes to this pandemic, that we are far better served to move quickly and aggressively to address the challenge as we see it, instead of waiting for the data to confirm where we know this is going to land, right? We know the most exposed communities that are in Massachusetts, whether that's Black and brown communities, whether that's immigrant communities, whether that's the poor, the elderly, veterans, as we've so prominently seen in Holyoke in particular.
And not to interrupt you, but I think that's one of the things that I've tried to really emphasize over the point of my campaign is that all of those groups, seniors, the working poor, veterans, immigrants, we all have our interests all align, and we need to stop letting those groups be pitted against one another. We all will be lifted up by better policy, and I'll let you take it away. But I think that's an important point that I really try to emphasize throughout my campaign.
Yeah, it's a critically important point, right? Like, this is not an either or. This is not a who's going to benefit. This is we need to move and move quickly now to make sure that the ultimate cost of the pandemic in dollars spent, in lives and cases, right, is minimized as much as possible. And that is true for flattening the curve. That is true for eliminating the virus's presence within our borders to the extent that any one state can. But it's also true for recovering. And there are certain steps that we need to take throughout that to ensure that everyone is operating with the same incentives, right? And we know that without emergency paid sick leave, that workers who have paid time off, workers who can work remotely, who don't have to worry about if their paycheck goes away if they don't show up at the office, that those workers are better aligned with what we ought to be doing from a public health perspective.
Right.
But if you
interrupt you again, sorry, I know you're here, but it was just announced today that I've been endorsed by 32BJ SEIU, and these are the people, the janitors, people that are working in factories, people that are working at the airport, people that are keeping things moving, that have been keeping things moving all year, the essential workers. And the reason why they're endorsing candidates like me all over the state is because earned paid sick time is a perfect example of the lack of urgency. This pandemic has been raging since March. Back in late March, Raise Up Massachusetts and affiliated labor groups said we need emergency paid sick time. We need to make sure that nobody is going to lose a paycheck because they choose to stay home when they're sick right now, not only because it's a pandemic and we should be sensitive to the needs of working people, but also it's bad for everybody if people feel like they have to go in to work sick. That was in March. Is it August? I've lost track of time. It's August, and that bill still hasn't come through.
March is what it is.
And that's just an example of the sort of lack of urgency that we've been talking about. Kick it over to you. I hope I didn't ruin your train of thought too much.
No, not at all. You have the most immediate and obvious and sort of pressing of steps that can be taken to both, limit the impact of the virus and the virus's spread. So if somebody has a temperature or feels like they might have the symptoms of COVID, that they can take the steps that are aligned with public health and stay home that day. But also so that moving forward, right, they have those protections as we begin to reopen. Right. But then we also know, right, if we're gonna recover and not just have a recovery that bakes in the inequality that had been growing across Massachusetts, economic inequality, racial inequality, regional inequality, we need to have a recovery that invests in solving the big problems facing us, that invests in tackling inequality through transportation investments, education investments, but also avoids the next coming crisis of climate change, right? And actually puts forward bold plans like the ones that you've put forward in your platform, Joe, that would make Massachusetts join the 13 other states with 100% renewable commitment, that basically reinstall our leadership position when it comes to tackling climate change.
Right.
We haven't done that on transportation. That's been a multi-generational failure. That's a bipartisan failure. That is not a Democrat-Republican thing.
Right.
That is just a status quo thing, and we cannot afford that. And we've punted again this session, right? Just the best efforts, many advocates, and many great legislators working on that. And on climate, for me, it is especially frustrating because I see where Nexamp is growing. We're growing in a state like New York that has put out a significant, investment in clean energy, clear guidelines on where they are headed. And here in Massachusetts, we seem to want to say, well, where we are is good enough, and we'll go from there. And we're better than that, and the science demands that we be better than that.
Right. And I mean, I know this point has been made so many times, but it's a false choice to choose between sort of the economy and the public health and climate here, where we have this incredible opportunity to claim that leadership position in renewable energy. It is an emerging industry that's employing lots and lots of people in those sort of middle skill jobs that we really need to grow, especially in communities like Revere and in communities like Chelsea and in communities like Saugus and like Pittsfield. And we're letting that leadership position slip away. And it's not because the technology doesn't exist or because it's not there. It's because of self-inflicted mistakes, of keeping the cap on net metering, which, if you could expand upon that a little bit. And when it comes to offshore wind, these permitting hurdles that are in the way of making us a true leader in offshore wind. The wind conditions here set us up to be the Denmark or the Germany of North America, and we're letting that advantage slip away. And if you want to elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, on all fronts, Joe. Right. So first, right, we have the ability to do these projects. Nexamp, we're working on a project with IBEW Local 103 at their facility in Dorchester right now. We're working on one with an academic medical center in the greater Boston area. with a manufacturer back in my hometown in Pittsfield. The opportunities are sitting there. The businesses, the organizations, the municipalities, they want to do more of this. They see that benefit, right? And we used to see job growth in every region of the state in clean energy up until the last 3 years. And that's because we have delays from the utility companies that are holding up over a gigawatt of solar energy in the central part of the state. Most of the delays on offshore wind, to folks' credit here in Massachusetts, are not local. They are federally driven. But again, that just calls on us to be doing everything we can at the local level. And the great thing, to your point, about these jobs is they have to be done here, right? You're not going to pick up a factory building, put it on a boat to China, and retrofit there. That work has to be done here. It should be done by union workers, get a fair wage, and be able to see the work that they did benefit the community, right? And the final point, a point you've made very well throughout your campaign, is that communities like Chelsea and Revere have borne the brunt of environmental injustice for years. Those are the communities that we're investing in to make sure that they benefit the most from the transition to a clean energy economy. And that's personal for me, right? We saw that from GE growing up, where we had to deal with the cleanup from decades of PCB. We have the opportunity to do it. It's sitting right there. And I think that's what frustrates people like you and I, and that it's right there. We just need the political leadership like you've shown through your platform to be actually turning this from a platform into jobs and reality.
Right. And I think one of the things that's frustrating too is that it's not that there aren't a lot of representatives that don't understand this, or even to some extent, care. But the process is broken of how we get, being able to get these things done. You've been there, you've been in these meetings, you've seen what happens, when we try to push these types of things through. Talk a little bit about some of your experiences and the roadblocks to this meaningful change.
So I think first there's a sort of a mentality and a culture, right? Like a belief that, all right, well, we'll get to this issue at some point this session, if you're lucky, right? Among the 8,000 bills that get filed every year. Well, this session, unfortunately, has increasingly meant the final 2 to 3 to 4 weeks of the session, if you're lucky. And when that gets compressed, it limits the ability of the public to engage with their legislators to talk about their priorities. And it maximizes the power that insiders, that lobbyists, that others have to be able to exert their influence. Because these are complicated issues, right? It is not that it is easy to get every last aspect of it right. Reps and senators are rightly concerned and want to do the right thing. And when there is any type of confusion, lack of clarity on these issues, which is what you get when the schedule is compressed, then you don't have the ability for the big, bold initiatives that we know we need to actually move the dial on climate, on economic inequality. And I think that's the biggest structural impediment at this point is the push to the end of session. It empowers the status quo. So it's always easy to put it off to the next session. But we know we've got a decade on climate. We know we only have so long before the effects of economic inequality are irreversible, right? We have to act now.
Right. No, and I think I remember being at the State House, I forget what year it was, for one of those marathon sessions on July 31st. And, that was supposed to be legally the last day of the session. And a bill ended up going over the line at 1:30 a.m. And there was a lot of constitutional debate over whether that counted. There are other bills that passed they'd have to go back and fix because there were mistakes in them. And, and this is why, when you look at groups like 32BJ SEIU, when you look at groups like the Massachusetts Teachers Association and Boston Teachers Union, which are pushing, not only for fair investment in education, but really they've, to their credit, have become leaders in focusing on the sort of intersectional problems that lead to educational inequality. They're not just looking for candidates that sort of have the right platform. They're looking for candidates that really want to push to make structural change at the State House, to really democratize, what's happening at the State House, that don't want to continue the status quo, that do want to see more things come to a public vote and have more of this happen out in the daylight. We talked a little bit about the environment. I think very much connected to this is transportation, which I know is an issue that we're both passionate about, and maybe share a little bit of some of your stories and what you know about where we've gone wrong on transportation.
Yeah, I think it's either the most hopeful thing about transportation or the most frustrating thing,
right,
is that every region of the state thinks everybody else is making out just fine with the status quo, right? People where I grew up in Western Mass look at Eastern Mass and say, we'd do anything to have the T because the BRTA stops running way too early. It doesn't run on weekends. You know, it's the limits that the BRTA puts on sort of folks who are dependent on that service are astronomical, right? It radically impacts their lives. People in Eastern Mass rightly look at investments made in roads and bridges in the western part of the state and say, well, why are we spending all that when we've got huge budget deficits at our RTAs, the MBTA in particular, and we know we need to be putting more people on transit if we want to limit the transportation impact on climate, right? You know, so from my perspective, that is both reason to be frustrated, right? Because everyone feels like they aren't getting enough, but also reason to be hopeful, right? Because if we have a bigger vision about what our transportation system can be, which is a tool to reduce economic inequality and to help us solve climate change and drive economic development, not just in greater Boston, right? Not just in the downtown Boston core, but in outer lying communities, in our gateway cities and the regions that surround them, then, you know, the sky is the limit for Massachusetts, right? And, you know, that's a way to take pressure off of the housing market. It's a way to reduce congestion, right? But we're not going to get there by cutting our way to a better, brighter future, right? And I worry that that is the path that our leaders are taking in response to limited ridership, when we ought to be having a campaign that outlines every step the T and every other RTA is doing to make them the safest agencies in the nation and to encourage ridership moving forward.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I view it when I try to talk about the T, because it can be tough. I'm a T rider. You know, I've always been
same here every day. Every day I drop my son off at the East Boston Y. Like we love it. He's asking for when we can ride the T again.
And as a kid, I mean, this is just going back to when I was a kid. That was freedom for me. You know, a teenager being able to jump on the T and go into Boston. Thought that was the coolest thing in the world. But I think what's important when talking about these issues is how it impacts people sort of across the spectrum. So there's not just T enthusiasts, but there's certain people, not because they're an enthusiast, but because they really do rely on public transportation to get around. Senior citizens, people with disabilities, people that are very poor, that are spending so much of their income on housing, and it just simply doesn't make economic sense for them to have a car. And I think this is true of a lot of people in Chelsea, you know, in my district, where rents are going up in Chelsea, parking is difficult in Chelsea. It makes more sense to rely on transit. So you have those people on one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, you have people who just never have or will get on a bus or train in their lives. And, you know, but the important thing to remember is that they benefit extensively from a well-functioning MBTA, you know, because every person that takes the T is a car off the road. And the way traffic works, you know, you get a few people off the road and that has huge knock-on benefits to traffic. And also to economic development in your communities. And that's where the sort of people in between are, which is, you know, maybe people that might use the T sometimes or might drive sometimes. Is if you have more transportation options, all of a sudden you have more job options, you have more housing options. And I think that's where it's so crucial for a place like Revere, and as well as Chelsea, but obviously I feel it more closely because Revere is my hometown, where, you know, we've been saying for years, and it's happening, that change is coming down the blue line, you know, the way it did in East Boston and the way it did in Jamaica Plain. And, you know, and to some extent, we see the benefits of investment in the community, and that's good. You know, we like seeing business come into the community. We like seeing jobs be created for our residents. We don't like, you know, the displacement pressures that come with that, the housing cost pressures that come with that. And, you know, it's not rocket science why that's happening. It's happening because there's only so many neighborhoods that have T access to downtown Boston where all the jobs are. And so that pressure on that housing market is going to move around and find the places where it's a little bit cheaper, which happens to be Revere right now. If we want to prevent this pattern from repeating itself, the only way we can do that is really dramatically expand and improve upon our public transportation system. Because it means, first of all, we can deconcentrate the jobs a little bit so that not all the jobs are in downtown Boston, which, not only from an economic development standpoint, but just from an equality standpoint, it would be great for every region to make sure that we can create good jobs all over the state. But it would also alleviate the housing burdens, because if you are, a person that wants to live in the Boston area and work in the Seaport or something, or work in Cambridge, it expands your options of neighborhoods and places to live and housing choices, and takes some of the pressure off a place like Revere, like East Boston, like Dorchester. And we've really, the frustrating thing is, not only have we known for years that this was kind of coming, we also kind of know what we need to do. Like, it's sort of already been sketched out how we can dramatically transform our transportation system without even building a whole bunch of new infrastructure, but really just using what we already have. And can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and to tie it into the article I wrote too, Joe, right? Like, we've known about this problem for some time.
Right.
We've got a transportation system that was planned in the 70s, built in the 80s, burdened with debt for the 90s, right? We've ignored for the better part of this century. Right? And that's the unfortunate reality and history of transportation policy and finance in Massachusetts. And when I got to the legislature in 2007, one of the first things I got was a Transportation Finance Commission report that outlined the reforms there could be to the existing agencies and the need for investment. And then the need for investment has only grown by at least twofold since, based on the reports that have been done since.
Right.
The thing that we've been good about when it comes to transportation is documenting the need for greater investment, having been good at actually acting on that need for greater investment.
We're really good at study commissions here, and not so great at action, and and this makes sense, I think, to anyone that works, right? But if you have a backlog of things that you need to get done and you ignore it, the cost only goes up. It never goes down. The problems never go away by themselves. And so, I will give credit, they have cut into the backlog of repairs, the sort of core subway system. That is to the Baker administration's credit. The MBTA control board has been a really excellent addition to sort of add a level of management there that's been helpful. But I also think that that's just not nearly enough. We have so much more that we need to do, and we know what we need to do. And we have a comment that came in, and I'll put on the screen a little. I'm not sure that that's going to happen anytime soon, but look, let's talk about it. Let's talk about the need for regional trains, that run across the state.
Yeah, I would take it even a step further, right? One, we absolutely ought to have regional rail. We need to have, as my colleagues, my former colleagues and my dear friends in Western Mass would call it, West-East rail.
The brain train, as Ed Markey would call it.
I would take it one further, right? It ought to be Boston to Albany, right? You've got the Lakeshore Limited runs those lines. A few times during my time in office, I was able to line up my schedule to take it. One of the ultimate frustrations, that line doesn't double up. So I sat in Dalton for 45 minutes, the town next to Pittsfield, unable to get home. And really, again, it is a matter of laying out that vision and prioritizing it. And, on this one in particular, the governor has had unified control of all of the transportation agencies in Massachusetts at a level unlike any other governor before him has had. While there has been certainly improvements on some of the backlog of investments, I don't think we have seen the embrace of what that unified control could mean.
Right.
And we haven't seen highlighting the need for investment. It's one thing to put $50 million towards the system when it's crumbling. It's a whole nother thing to have a long-term vision for where we need to get to that would allow, rail to Pittsfield to be funded. Like, we finally gotten to the Green Line extension. Like, we need to get to South Coast Rail. Like, we need to build out the entire broader regional rail vision that the control board adopted and supported, right? So, yes, we need it. We need a better way to finance it. And it's key that we have this debate again with the urgency that we can't just get through another legislative session and say, transportation in Massachusetts, what are you going to do? At some point, there are real costs and impacts, and we need to address them.
And we're already seeing them, right? I think we kind of had reached a tipping point pre-COVID where the congestion had gotten so bad that I do think it was very close to having a huge negative impact on our economy. If we had let that play out, I think we would have started to see the influx of investment, which is good, and you like to see it, would have reversed, because you just can't tolerate that sort of level of gridlock. And then we were also heading down the path towards being sort of San Francisco 2.0, where you couldn't afford to live in the city or the surrounding areas unless you made like $150,000 a year. But then a city needs its service workers and its essential people to fuel up. And so in order to afford to keep the economy moving, people need to live an hour and a half outside of the city and drive to get in and to be those service workers and to work in the restaurants and to work in the coffee shops. And that's just, you can't run a city like that. It's just, it'll eventually collapse upon itself and become too unaffordable and too economically unviable. And we were really careening down that path in a lot of different ways pre-COVID.
Yeah, absolutely, Joe. I mean, I don't, I can't recall an early morning meeting that, in the pre-COVID times, right, that didn't start with, oh, well, so-and-so's delayed, they're caught up in traffic, or, yeah, no, they couldn't make it, they're calling in. Every single one at least started with, boy, that was a horrible commute, and here's why.
Right.
Or, yeah, so-and-so is just going to have to call in, they can't make it for one reason or another. Commuter rail is down, stuck in traffic, one way or the other. So it already was having an impact. And if we get the economy recovering the way we want it to, it will be an impact if we haven't come up with a plan to make the investments we need to and build the system that we need.
Right. And that's why I've tried to lay out some detailed plans over the course of my campaign, and I think that some will say you don't need that to run for state representative, or that it's, not necessary, that you can't do all which is true. Look, all the things that I say that I want to do, I can't make it happen myself. I can't. But what we do need is people that do have this long-term vision, and it can't just be me, but I think we are seeing all over the state, we're seeing competitive races of people who say we need to stop governing for tomorrow and start governing for the next 10 years. We need to stop looking at what we can sort of do in the short term to get a little win and a little PR, and think about, what does this whole state, what do our communities need for the next 10, 20, 30 years? And that's what laying out these plans is all about.
Yep.
I can't tell you that, if you send me to the State House, that in 2 years I'll complete my term, we'll have regional rail, we'll alleviate all of, greater Boston's traffic problems, everyone will have pre-K. But we need to have that vision of where we need to go, and that's what's lacking. I don't think we're lacking necessarily in values. I think, having worked there, I think people do have the right values. They support education, they support the environment, but there's that lack of vision, that lack of, here are the things that if we get to these, we can really tackle some of these problems. And so I do want to pivot a little bit to education, because that's another example of an area where, we are the leader. Massachusetts still is the leader in education in a lot of ways, but we're at risk of seeing it slip if we don't take these important next steps. And we're also seeing the fact that we may be number one in education, but it's number one for whom, right? And it's not for everyone. It's certainly not for a kid that was born in Chelsea, or probably not for a kid that was born in Pittsfield. It's great if you were born in Wellesley or Belmont. You're doing good. You do have the best public schools maybe in the world. But in order to really tackle these inequities in education and give every kid a fair shot, we need to start with making sure that everyone has pre-K. That's something that's just very unequal right now, where some communities have access to pre-K for 3 and 4 year olds and some don't. And we also need to make sure that we're supporting people no matter how they learn, and that means that if people want to go to vocational or technical school, that's available to them. We have thousands of kids on waiting lists all over the state to go to these schools. This is like the easiest win imaginable. If we fix this, I can't think of a single constituency that wouldn't be happy. I'm a liberal. I love education, right? I think a lot of conservatives and moderates would agree that it's great to invest in training people to get into the building trades. Unions would like it. Companies would like it, because you're getting a pool of better trained workers. I mean, this is just the easiest win imaginable if we were to expand those seats and give everyone access to vocational and technical education if they want it, to community college if they want it, to job training programs. And I remember Governor Patrick, I think in 2010 saying, let's make community college free, to make sure that we can get people to train them to work in solar energy, to work in advanced manufacturing and robotics, and it's great that we were thinking about it then, but it's 10 years later and we still are having the same conversation. And the opportunity is still sitting there before us because we still can be a leader if we act soon.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have too often touted the fact that we're, first in the nation on most of the standardized scoring. And to your point, Joe, right? Like first in the nation, but for who?
Right.
We know, and we have known for some time, and this gets to the urgency point again, we have known for some time that there are inequities in the system generally. There are inequities in state funding and state support for the K through 12 system. There are massive gaps in the early education system. We know that within that K through 12 system, again, to your point, we don't do a good enough job to ensure access to vocational technical education. To the part of the world that I know best, if a kid's born in North Adams, they're in McCann Tech and they're good to go in a great technical vocational school. If they're born in Sheffield in the Southern Berkshires, then their access to that same program is significantly diminished. And that's those disparities, for no sake other than the lottery of life, are everywhere across Massachusetts.
Right.
And at a time where we know the investment in higher education is critically important, we're continuing to cut back. And even when we get it right, our solution in the form of the Student Opportunity Act is phased in over 7 years.
Right.
Phased in over 7 years. So if you're a fifth grader today and it's actually phased in on the same schedule, you're not benefiting from that fully until you're graduating from high school.
Right.
But we can do better than that.
Right.
And we need to have the leadership that calls on us to do precisely that.
Right. And we need to do better than that. And that is ultimately why I decided to run. I think this is such an important year. And I know the Celtics just started, so I got to let you go. I don't want to keep you too long. I've got my Bruins flag ready to go for 8:00, so I'm not in as much of a hurry. But this is such an important year for a number of reasons. I think I almost use a bad word, but the fiasco that is our federal government has opened a lot more people's eyes to the importance of really what's happening at their state and local government for a few reasons. First of all, because a lot of the broken policies that sort of led to the Trump era started with bad state and local policies. That's where I think a lot of people felt let down by their government, felt like they weren't given access to opportunity. And we see a lot of this, anger and resentment that led to the political situation that we're in now. But also people are looking for ways to make an impact. They're looking for ways to make their communities better. And then I also think, quite frankly, that a lot of people that are on the Democratic or progressive side ignored the importance of state and local government for a long time. And that's finally changing, which is long overdue, because if you want to make a big impact, we need to do everything we can to get Donald Trump out of the White House. But if we want to really improve the quality of life of people in our communities, we have to build better state and local government. And because of the energy and attention and the focus that's on this right now, this is such a crucial year to build legislative power. And I saw and I felt and I could see the excitement of some of the races around the state, where there are candidates that are pushing to think bigger, to challenge the status quo, to make the legislature, to bring some sunshine in to the state house and really push to do more and to think bigger about these challenges. And I felt like our communities really deserve that conversation. I can't say that I ever had a desire to see my name on a sign or go to a lot of county fairs. That's not necessarily you may probably be able to tell I'm kind of a policy wonk. I've always liked being behind the scenes. It was always kind of doing the nuts and bolts work was more my thing, less so the pageantry of politics. But it's just this time calls for more urgent solutions to the challenges that we're facing. The status quo is okay. I don't think that we have terrible leadership in Massachusetts. You compare us to a lot of other states and we look pretty good, but that's not good enough to me. And I think it's not good enough to other people in Massachusetts either. We can do better. We can talk about how we can do better. And all over the state, we need to be having these really competitive and thoughtful conversations about how we can do better as a state. So that's why I decided to run. It's why I hope that I'll earn your vote on September 1st on primary day. And I just ask if you've watched tonight and you do support what we're trying to do, please reach out. We could use your help. Call your friends. Share this on social media. Plug us. Reach out. See if you want to come to a sign holding. Donate if you can. We're in these final 15 days. We are running this grassroots sort of insurgent campaign, but I feel good about the way it's going because I think people are hungry for these kinds of conversations. And Ben, I think you would agree that that's not just true of people in Revere, Chelsea, and Saugus. I think we're seeing it all over Massachusetts. People are getting excited about the opportunity to think bigger about what state government can do.
People want to be called upon to be a part of something bigger, right? At a time where we are rightfully asked to stay apart from one another,
right?
People are looking for and yearning for that opportunity to come together. And what better way than to come around big ideas like those that you've put forward and that others have put forward, Joe. And, to anyone who thinks your vote doesn't matter, I won my first race by 243 votes out of something like 23,467. Not that I remember exact numbers. Your vote counts. So please do, if you live in the district, show up and give my friend a vote.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Ben. I really appreciate it. I look forward to continuing our conversations. I sincerely hope to be picking your brain in January about, bringing up some bills that you worked on and making that big progress that we've wanted to see for a long time.
I hope that with a 3-year-old and a 4-month-old that there's something there for you to pick come January.
Sounds good. Well, thank you so much, and have a great night, everybody. Go Celtics, go Bruins, stay safe, and remember to vote September 1st. Thank you.